In this video, we're going to take a look at Sailor Studio 670. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. This is a perfect example of why I like trying inks. It's yellow, not a color I think anybody ever thinks they'll like in an ink, and yet there's yellows like this one that are absolutely amazing to look at. This shades a lot to a golden yellow and is easy to read on the page. Now, when it first goes down, it's much lighter, but it does darken, and the shading really does come out given a little bit of time. And a little bit of time is like a minute. It really becomes very nice to look at. I've come to appreciate and own some yellow inks. Now, this isn't the one that caused it to happen, but it's one of the ones where I did go get a bottle of because I suspected I was going to enjoy it a lot, and I'm glad I got that bottle. I just wish it was acceptable to use a yellow ink in a professional environment. That would make for a very interesting world to have very different colors that could show up in your normal office setting instead of your normal blues and blacks and being kind of dull in that way. A yellow ink like this really makes you appreciate how many different colors we get to use when we use fountain pens. I love this ink. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Cross Bailey with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. The fine nib has no feathering and no spread, and holy cow, can we say this shades beautifully. It's so nice. It really is. I'm looking at this, and if every ink shaded like this, I would be in serious, serious trouble. The medium is a little bit darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread, and some of the best shading I've ever seen. Just choose any word and watch the color shift from darkers to lights to dark to light over and over again. It is truly amazing to look at. The broad is just a little bit lighter than the medium, about the same tone as the fine, with no feather, no spread, and yes, shading please, delivered. When we look at the back of the page, we get no ghosting and, as you would expect, no bleeding. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a TWSBI Mini with a fine nib, a Jinhao X450 with a medium nib, a Levenger TrueWriter with a broad nib, The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. With this toned paper, we still get a bunch of very nice shading. It's not making any kind of negative effect onto the shading and color of this ink, where I was very interested to see what happens with a yellow with a cream color paper. And you want to know what? Nothing. It looks awesome. The medium is a little bit darker than the fine with no feather, no spread, great shading. I don't know what else to say for that. If this ink was adopted by a cereal, Tony the Tiger would want this ink. The broad is the same tone as the medium with no feather, no spread, great shading all the way through. I love how this looks. It's it's a shame it's a small bottle because I may destroy this thing. Looking at the back of the page, we do get a tiny bit of ghosting, but absolutely no bleed. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We do get some pretty decent shading. The shading here is not as good as we saw on the Leuchtterm, but this is a little bit more absorbent, which I think is causing not all of it to come out. But it's definitely there when you look at the because. The B and the E are much darker. The top of the F of is darker than the rest of the rest of the world. It's darker than the rest of the world. It's a dark, dark souled ink. The medium is about the same tone as the fine with no feather, no spread, and still some decent shading, especially for this paper. It's not as standout shading as we've seen on the other two papers, but it's still doing a really good job here. And the broad is just a tad bit lighter than the medium with no feather, no spread. I think the shading looks a bit nicer on the broad than it did on the medium. And I think that's just a function of it being a little bit drier pen, where that medium is quite a bit wetter. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and the only most minor of ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We do get some shading. It's not too bad. It's just that in general on this paper, we are getting a lighter tone than we've gotten on the other papers. And in fact, a lighter tone than we're going to get with the others. Now, this paper has frequently given us lighter tones than we've gotten in other papers, but not the end of the world. The medium is much darker than the fine, absolutely perfectly usable, with no feather, no spread, and some amazing shading. It is, I can see this being used in school because it is easy to read. It is not hard on your eyes at all. And the broad is about the same tone as the medium, but it shows more medium to dark tone and less of the lighter tones, which the medium nib did have some of. It has no feathering, it has no spread, which is always a good thing. And when we look at the back of the page, we get very minor ghosting and no bleed through. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Krishna Danu Udak. Here is Krishna Yellow Valley. Here is Pilot Mixable Yellow. Here is tag Kayo no Oto Yamabuki Iro. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feathering, but we do get a tiny bit of spread. We get shading throughout a bunch of this, which is great when you're using a cheap paper like this. The medium is quite a bit darker than the fine, with no feathering, a tiny bit of spread. So, in general, we're seeing some spread, but it's still being incredibly well behaved, despite the fact that generally we think of notebook paper as garbage paper, but it's performing very well. This shading is absolutely awesome. The broad is just a little bit lighter in general than the medium, with no feather, only the tiniest bit of spread again, but it's not even going to a double broad. It's just a little bit wider than a broad. So this ink on this paper is an absolute winner. Looking at the back of the page, you do get some minor ghosting, but no bleed through whatsoever. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a turquoise ink by Blackstone, their Blue Cypress. Here is a green ink by Diamine, their Delamere Green. Here is a black ink by Graf von Faber-Castell, Carbon Black. Here's a brown ink by Noodler's, Brown. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we do get quite a bit of spread. We get almost no feathering. There's some feathering, and it's really tiny in a few spots. Like if you look at the bottom of the H in he, where it is much darker. If you look at on nevertheless, less has a lot more feathering than the rest of the word. Now, it is shading, and this is a very cheap paper that is going to be prone to feathering and bleeding and all the bad stuff, but it normally doesn't shade, and it does here. Medium is the same tone as the fine. It has tiny feathers on it, but not horrible. It does have a little bit of spread, but not a big deal. It's not like I'm writing with a marker. It is giving only a couple of spots of shading. Not a lot, but there is a couple of moments of it. I just don't know about this for it. The broad does have feathering. It does have some spread. It does have a couple moments of shading. So overall, I can say that the ink is doing fairly well in how it looks. When we open this up, we see I circled 3 spots where it did touch the page underneath in the bleeding. So those spots probably wouldn't stop you from using it, but it does touch the page underneath, and there's plenty of ghosting. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? Now, I enjoy how this ink looks all the time. It does shade and looks good always. So it's hitting the two major spots that I really care about. It has a great tone on the paper to look at, it's easy to read, and the shading is absolutely nice. It makes my writing look better than it is. So it is a dealer's choice. You can use this in any pen and it's going to look good. But if I was to make a choice, my preference is for this to go with a very wet medium nib because I thought that's where it looked its best, which is hard when it always looks good. Thanks for watching.